He picked up the medal, but what did he really lift? Welcome to our channel. We're so excited to have you here with us today. Before we dive into this incredible story, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us know. Your thoughts and feedback mean the world to us. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next special episode coming tomorrow. Get ready for an unforgettable journey. Let's get started. The sun was barely rising over Buckingham Palace, casting a soft glow over the grand stone walls. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of dew and the distant hum of city life. It was early, and the palace grounds were already bustling with activity. Tourists with cameras and selfie sticks crowded the gates, capturing the timeless beauty of the palace. Yet amid all the modern noise and movement, one figure stood perfectly still. Guard James Bennett, 34 years old, was a silent sentinel of tradition. Dressed in his iconic scarlet tunic and shiny black boots, he stood motionless at his post. His bare skin cap was perfectly aligned, and his posture was impeccable, so straight it could have been sculpted by an artist. His expression was solemn, eyes fixed on the horizon, observing everything without ever shifting. His entire presence exuded discipline, the kind that comes with years of training and unwavering dedication. While tourists walked past, eagerly snapping photos and marveling at the grandeur of the palace, James was a pillar of stillness, a symbol of the centuries-old traditions that had been passed down through the generations. His job was simple in its execution, but profound in its meaning. As the world rushed by, he remained unchanged, a constant reminder of the royal guard's sacred duty to protect and honor the history of the monarchy. The bustling crowd surrounding him was a stark contrast to the calm in his demeanor. Yet, in the midst of it all, James didn't falter. He had long learned how to tune out the distractions of modern life, focusing solely on the tradition he was sworn to uphold. With each passing moment, as more tourists arrived and the sounds of the city grew louder, he remained as unmoved as the stone statues that dotted the palace grounds. His presence was a silent statement. James Bennett was not just standing there. He was embodying something much larger than himself. He was a living testament to the enduring strength of discipline, tradition, and the unwavering commitment to duty that had been passed down through the ages at Buckingham Palace. As the morning wore on, a black cab pulled up on the far side of the palace courtyard, the tires hissing slightly against the wet stones. The crowd, ever growing with eager tourists, barely took notice of the elderly man who emerged from the vehicle. George Alden, 85 years old, moved slowly, his every step deliberate and measured. Time had weathered him, his once sharp eyes now dimmed with age, his back slightly bent from years of service and hardship. But despite the passage of time, the pride in his posture remained unwavering. George was not just any old man. He was a former British Army veteran, decorated for acts of bravery in his youth. Today, he carried with him the weight of his past, a small velvet box clutched in one hand and a worn wooden cane in the other. The medals inside the box were not just pieces of metal. They represented the lives he had touched, the battles he had fought, and the sacrifices he had made. 2 medals for valor, one for his heroism in Cyprus, the other for leading a rescue mission in the Fallens. They were his personal history, his badge of honor, and the weight of his years. Despite the pain in his knees and the creak of his joints, George moved steadily forward. His eyes never left Guard Bennett, not even for a moment. As he neared the palace gates, George didn't glance at the majestic architecture or the surrounding crowds. His gaze was fixed solely on the man standing tall at his post. It was a look that only a fellow soldier could understand, an unspoken connection between 2 men who had served their country, who shared a bond that transcended words. Guard Bennett, who had remained unshaken amidst the growing crowd, noticed the elderly veteran approaching. It wasn't a glance nor a nod, but something subtler, a shift in his stance, a slight straightening of his posture. It was a recognition, a silent acknowledgement of shared history and mutual respect. Though they had never met, there was an understanding between them, one forged in the crucible of military service. George had fought for his country, and James, though younger, stood guard over its traditions. In that brief moment, it wasn't just two men in uniform. It was a passing of the torch, a silent salute to everything they had each given in service. As George stood just 10 feet from Guard Bennett, a heavy silence hung in the air. The elderly man's hands trembled as he opened the velvet box, revealing the two medals inside. They gleamed in the morning light, their ribbons faded but still full of meaning. With painstaking effort, George tried to pin them to his coat, but his arthritic fingers betrayed him. The medals slipped from his hands and fell to the cold stone ground with a sharp, painful sound. The clink of metal against stone echoed louder than it should have, each ring reverberating through the courtyard. It was a sound that, in its bluntness, cut through the morning's calm like a knife. The laughter came almost immediately. A few teenagers nearby, too young to understand the weight of what they were witnessing, snickered at the scene. One of them pointed, mocking, "Oi, look, the old man's dropping his tin badges." The cruel words were quiet, but enough to sting. The disrespect was palpable, a stark contrast to the reverence George had carried with him all his life. A woman nearby stepped forward, scolding the teens with a sharp, "Hey, leave him be." But it wasn't enough. The damage had already been done. Bennett's jaw tightened, his muscles stiffened, yet he remained still. His eyes followed the medals as they skidded across the stone, each movement of the medal reminding him of the wars he had witnessed, the sacrifices made. He felt a surge of emotion rise within him. He had once been in a situation where the stakes were far higher. He thought back to a time when he had disobeyed direct orders to save a fellow soldier, an act that had earned him both a reprimand and a decoration. His actions then, too, had been a choice made for honor over protocol, much like the choice he now faced. The teens continued to laugh, oblivious to the deeper implications of what was happening. And yet, as George bent slowly to retrieve the fallen medals, his hands shaking with effort, Guard Bennett remained unmoved in his stance. The code was clear: do not break formation no matter what. But in that moment, as the laughter echoed louder and the crowd's murmurs grew, something within Bennett shifted. He took a slow, deliberate breath. His decision was made. Breaking protocol was unthinkable, yet in this moment, it was the only choice that made sense. Without another thought, Bennett stepped forward. The crowd gasped, unaware of what was happening, as the Royal Guard approached the fallen medals. His knees bent slightly as he knelt, his gloved hands carefully picking up the medals as if they were sacred objects. He examined them for a brief moment before returning them to George with reverence. No words were exchanged. It was a simple, silent act of respect. And as he stood to return to his post, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavier, as though the weight of history itself had shifted in that brief, quiet moment. The tourists, once busy with their cameras, now seemed to grasp something deeper, something intangible about what it meant to serve and to honor. And as George took the medals back into his hands, his trembling fingers clasping them tightly, a sense of dignity slowly began to return. As Guard Bennett stood up, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace shifted. The crowd, once lost in the hum of modern life, suddenly fell silent. The subtle yet powerful act of picking up the medals had reverberated through the air, and now the tension was palpable. Tourists, once eager to snap photos of the grandeur of the palace, were now transfixed by the quiet, powerful moment they had just witnessed. They had come for the spectacle of royal guards standing motionless, for the pageantry of tradition. But what they saw was something deeper, something that transcended ceremony. Bennett, having returned the medals to George without a word, resumed his post. But the act had broken something within him, something that could never be unbroken. The protocols of the Royal Guard were ironclad, and he had defied them. In breaking formation, he had sacrificed a piece of his professional duty for something far more important: respect. The rules that governed his every movement no longer felt as binding as the responsibility to honor those who had served before him. In that brief act of kindness, Bennett had reminded everyone around him, including himself, that there were moments when tradition had to bend in order to preserve the essence of what it stood for. The silence that followed was not just the absence of sound. It was the weight of history, the recognition that in this very moment something had shifted. George Alden, the old veteran, stood a little taller now. His shoulders, once slumped with the weight of years and mockery, straightened. The medals, once a symbol of forgotten valor, now glinted proudly in his hands. He had been seen. His sacrifice had been acknowledged, not just by Bennett, but by a small crowd of strangers who for once understood the true meaning of respect. Yet, as the moment settled, the harsh reality of tradition and protocol could not be ignored. Across the street, a man in a gray trench coat lowered his camera. His eyes narrowed, and his fingers tapped a few quick commands into his phone. The violation had been documented. A royal guard, breaking formation in broad daylight. This was not just a minor slip-up. It was a breach of protocol that couldn't be overlooked. Commander Saul Fenwick, standing at the ready, would not let this pass unnoticed. Bennett's actions, however noble, had consequences, and soon Bennett would face the repercussions of his choice. What remained to be seen, however, was whether his defiance of the rules would ultimately be viewed as an act of valor or a dangerous lapse in duty. Would he be punished for his compassion, or would his actions inspire a change in the rigid structure that had governed the Royal Guards for centuries? As Bennett awaited the inevitable consequences, he knew one thing for certain. What he had done could never be undone, and for that he had no regrets. The weight of Bennett's actions hung in the air, and the storm was already brewing. As expected, the breach of protocol did not go unnoticed. Within hours, a report had been filed, and Commander Saul Fenwick, an enforcer of tradition, began his quiet but steady march toward ensuring that discipline would be maintained. The rules of the Royal Guard were sacred. Breaking them was unthinkable, especially in such a public display. Bennett had crossed a line, and now the cost of that decision loomed ahead. Inside the palace, whispers began to circulate. The media, ever hungry for controversy, had caught wind of the incident. A blurry, handheld video of Bennett's gesture, of him breaking formation to retrieve the medals, began to spread like wildfire. The clip went viral across social media platforms, on BBC, Reddit, and Twitter. It was everywhere. Debate raged over the guard's actions. Some hailed him as a hero, a man who chose respect over protocol, while others decried his actions as a dangerous lapse in duty. Was this a breach of tradition, or was it a necessary moment of humanity in a world that had grown too rigid? As the days passed, the public's reaction became impossible to ignore. Thousands, perhaps even millions, rallied behind Bennett. A petition calling for his recognition, not punishment, began to gather steam. Soon, over 500,000 people had signed, sharing stories of their own experiences of service and sacrifice, of moments when duty to a fellow human being was far more important than following cold, impersonal rules. Bennett had shown a side of the Royal Guard that few ever saw, their humanity. But for every voice of support, there was an equal and opposite push for discipline. The Royal Guard, after all, was a symbol of unyielding tradition, and traditions could not be compromised for the sake of sentiment. Bennett had violated not just a rule, but an institution. Would the Royal Guard allow such insubordination to stand unchallenged? Commander Fenwick didn't think so. Bennett, now aware of the consequences looming over him, couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how right he felt, there would be a price to pay. Yet as he sat in the mess hall, awaiting the inevitable internal hearing, he felt no regret. His conscience was clear. He had done what was right, regardless of the consequences. His act of defiance had shaken the foundation of tradition, and perhaps that was exactly what was needed. In the quiet of his small room, as the world outside continued to turn, Bennett realized something profound. Breaking protocol had made him a symbol, a catalyst for a conversation that had been long overdue. The world had seen a guard move not out of obligation, but out of a deep sense of respect for another soldier. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was time for tradition to evolve. As the days passed, the pressure surrounding Bennett only intensified. Despite the growing public support for his actions, there was a clear and undeniable fact. He had broken protocol. The Royal Guard, an institution built on centuries of unwavering discipline, had been shaken by his decision. Bennett knew that the consequences would come. What he didn't expect, however, was the way the story would unfold. The disciplinary committee was swift in its response. Bennett was summoned to an internal hearing, the weight of the Royal Guard's expectations heavy on his shoulders. Commander Fenwick presided over the proceedings with stern authority. His eyes narrowed as he flipped through the files documenting Bennett's breach of protocol. "Sergeant James Bennett," Fenwick began, his voice low but firm. "You stand before the Royal Guard Disciplinary Committee for breaking formation at precisely 11:13 a.m. yesterday morning. For a moment, you acted outside the bounds of your duty." There was no question in Fenwick's tone, no room for argument. It was clear that protocol had been violated. Yet as Bennett stood there, facing the committee, he remained calm. He didn't flinch. He didn't flounder. He was resolute. "I retrieved the medals of a fellow soldier," he said, his voice steady. "He could not. No one else would." His words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. "That is not your duty," Fenwick replied, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You were sworn to uphold the tradition of this institution. Your actions could not be justified." Bennett knew that Fenwick was right. Breaking formation, defying the sacred protocol of the Royal Guard, could not be justified by mere sentiment. But he also knew that what he had done was far more than a mere breach of rules. It was an act of honor, a display of humanity in a world governed by cold tradition. "With respect, Commander," Bennett continued, meeting Fenwick's gaze without hesitation, "it is always my duty to honor those who served." The tension in the room thickened. The committee members exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. In the silence that followed, Bennett's words seemed to linger, reverberating through the space. The committee had heard him, but whether they would act on it remained to be seen. Yet, as the hearing continued, it became clear that Bennett's fate would not be sealed so easily. Outside the hearing room, the public outcry grew louder. The voices of support for Bennett's actions could not be ignored. Thousands had rallied behind him, sharing stories of their own experiences of service and sacrifice, of moments when duty had meant more than following strict protocol. Bennett's actions, it seemed, had struck a chord. But as he sat in that cold, silent room, awaiting the committee's final decision, he couldn't help but wonder if the Royal Guard had truly understood what had transpired. The battle wasn't just for recognition. It was for the very soul of the institution. Would tradition remain unchallenged, or would Bennett's act inspire a change long overdue? The tension hung in the air, a question that only time would answer. In the days that followed, the story of Guard Bennett's act of defiance began to take on a life of its own. The media buzzed with coverage, the video of his act circulating widely across social platforms, sparking a heated debate about duty, tradition, and humanity. While the Royal Guard held firm in its disciplinary stance, the public outcry grew louder. What had begun as a single act of compassion had now ignited a movement, and within this movement, one voice stood out, the voice of George Alden. The elderly veteran, once humiliated by the callous laughter of teenagers and the disregard for his medals, had found new strength. In an interview with a young journalist, George, holding his medals with pride, spoke plainly but with conviction. "They're just pieces of metal," he said, his voice steady. "But what that young man did, he reminded me that they still meant something, that someone still saw them." His words carried weight. George didn't want Bennett punished. He wanted him recognized. The sentiment resonated with veterans, young cadets, and ordinary citizens alike. Across the country, a petition was launched, calling for Bennett to be honored for his actions rather than reprimanded. It wasn't long before the petition garnered over 500,000 signatures. Veterans posted photos of themselves saluting their screens, Young cadets reenacted the moment in TikTok videos, and even children shared their admiration for the act of compassion. It became clear that Bennett had struck a chord deep within the hearts of many. His decision to break protocol had done something far more profound than simply assisting an elderly man. It had reignited a conversation about the true meaning of service and duty. Yet despite the groundswell of public support, the Royal Guard's leadership remained resolute. Commander Fenwick, no stranger to tradition, was not easily swayed by public opinion. As Bennett sat in that hearing room, awaiting the final decision, the weight of the situation became even clearer. He had become a symbol, both a hero and a pariah, depending on who you asked. His actions had fractured the unyielding tradition of the Royal Guard, but in doing so, he had forced the institution to confront its own rigidity. Would Bennett be punished for his compassion, or would he be recognized for challenging an institution that had grown stale with tradition? The answer lay not just in the decision of the disciplinary committee, but in the heart of the British public. As the debate raged on, one thing was certain: Bennett's act had changed the conversation. It had brought into focus the true meaning of duty, honor, and respect, values that sometimes go beyond the rules and are rooted in the human heart. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this powerful moment of compassion and duty. What do you think about Guard Bennett's decision to break protocol? Was it an act of heroism, or did it go too far? Can tradition evolve without losing its core values? We want to hear your opinions and reflections on this story. Do you believe there are moments when breaking tradition is justified, especially when it's for the greater good? How do you think institutions like the Royal Guard should balance respect for tradition with the need for humanity and compassion? Also, what are your thoughts on George Alden's reaction? His journey from being mocked to being seen and respected is truly moving. Do you think his story and Bennett's act serve as a reminder that we need to honor those who served, regardless of the rules? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know where you stand on this. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with more powerful stories like this one. Your support means the world to us.